No worries. To start off, I'd just like to ask you, how did you actually become a naturopath and what was the journey leading up to that?
Um, Long story. Um,
Love a long story, so go ahead.
Righto. Well, I became a naturopath because of my health journey, and mostly because of the recovery, um, leading up to getting sick. It goes back to the mid to late 80s, basically. I was studying at uni full time, doing a science degree, majoring in psych, and I got into honours in psych, and I was going to be basically a psychologist. And I was also at the time training full time in a sport. So I had grown up through surf lifesaving and kayak paddling, and I had made national team in kayak or in sprint kayak paddle. I'd been in junior team, and then we were training to try and make national senior team with an eye to going to Olympics. So when I say training full time, we were training morning and night, sometimes a third time in the middle of the day. So I was doing a really solid program. The program at the time, back in those days, was really solid training program. And I was at uni all day. And um, at the time also, then the only job I could get or that I could fit in was working in pubs and stuff at night, which wasn't a very good combination because at one stage I started working in a nightclub on a Friday, Saturday night. And in those days you could smoke in pubs and clubs. So I'm working from 9 p.m. till 5 a.m. 2 nights a week, and then training full time and getting up and training at 6 a.m. the rest of the week. And it was a terrible combination. I look back at it and think, what was I thinking? Why would I have even tried to do that? Given the program we're doing was tough, and then the studies. I was at uni and studying pretty hard. So yeah, I pushed way too hard and got a chronic viral illness one year, and that sort of struck me down for about 3 months. And I recovered, but then because I missed 3 months of training and I had nationals coming up in 3 months or what have you, I went on the fast track and tried to get ready and recovered, and then that was okay. And then the next year we did the big training program again, and I wasn't studying as hard, but from what I've learned, the viral illness was probably the beginning of what then became post-viral fatigue. So the next year I made national team and raced over in Europe, but I started to have problems around that time, getting crook a little bit more often than I probably should, or that other people were. And then I came back, and then over the next few years, I just started to get sick more and more often. And to the extent that 3 or 4 years later, I was sick week on, week off, week on, week off, just crook all the time, missing heaps of training. Started to get really fatigued and run down. And then I moved to Brisbane thinking that the warmer weather might be better for my training because I was living in Melbourne. And it just got worse, and I couldn't train at all in the end. When I came home, I'd seen umpteen doctors because when I was in Victoria, I was in the Victorian Institute of Sport, and I'd had all sorts of blood tests done, and they were saying nothing wrong, as the blood tests often come out and saying there's nothing wrong. But I clearly had problems, with my immune system, and then in the end with energy levels and what have you. And then for a little while I was with AIS, and once again I still had problems. And the doctors weren't finding anything wrong. And so eventually I came home from Queensland and went and saw a doctor at Olympic Light Sports Park Sports Medicine, and he was one of the first doctors who actually spent the time to take a proper history, an extensive history, and said, "I know what's wrong with you, and we can't really do much other than you need to rest." And by that time, this was 5 or 6 years after the original virus, so it had just cumulatively got much, much worse. I couldn't even go for a walk down the street without being dizzy and feeling out of breath. And I was sort of working but struggling, just really tired, sick. Like if I drank alcohol, it'd wipe me out. I'd just be crook for, a week or two. So you know, it was really badly affecting my day-to-day function, and the idea of training by then, for the 6 to 12 months prior to that, was completely out of the question. So sort of those dreams of Olympics and, you know, those sort of things, that was all over. Yeah, and I was in a situation where I had this chronic illness. So that doctor, it was good. At least he was able to give me an answer and said, I could give you B shots and they'll give you temporary help, but they're not going to really fix your problem. You need to rest. Unfortunately, the rest didn't fix it either. I just got worse. But I was very fortunate that at some stage during that period, an ex-coach of mine, a friend of his, had been to see a Russian doctor who was practicing in Australia, and they had cancer and they made a recovery. And so they'd suggested that I go and see this Russian doctor, who was a research biochemist in Russia, who was also a doctor of medicine, who made a decision when he was doing all of these research in Russia to no longer use pharmaceutical medicines anymore. So he was only using natural medicines, even though he's a medical doctor. And he came to Australia on a scientific exchange via the CSIRO because of his research biochemistry. And by that time, he was practicing natural medicine in Australia. So he wasn't a doctor in Australia. He was a natural medicine practitioner, but I'd heard some really good results. So I booked in. It took me 6 months to get to see him. And I went and saw him. His name was Dr. Sultanov. And I went and saw him. And so, cutting a long story short, what I was dealing with was what the doctor initially from the Olympic Park Sports Medicine called overtraining syndrome, what we might now understand as post-viral syndrome or chronic fatigue syndrome. Not a lot of fun, as anyone who suffers from that will know. You get many tests done. Very rarely do they have conclusive results, or they don't tell you much. So I had a lot of people saying there's nothing wrong with him. You know, and in the sport, obviously it must have been hard for the coaches because the doctors are saying there's nothing wrong with him, and there clearly was. I wasn't making it up. I didn't want to not train and not achieve what I dreamed of doing for no reason. So it was really tricky, and I'd explored all sorts of things to try and get better. So I guess because the medical the medical approach couldn't help me, I explored a few other options to get better, and not all of them were not all of them helped, and a few of them were a bit left field, so didn't help either. People thought maybe I was a bit wacky, but I was just exploring. And I went and saw this Russian practitioner, and cut a long story short, after 4 to 6 months of treatment, I was completely better.
Wow.
And life had changed a lot, and so I didn't go back to training to the level that I had before because I was married and what have you. But I'd completely recovered. Mentally, I was still tentative and scared of getting back into training, but over a period of 6 months, I got back into exercise and found I had no problems.
Yeah.
So that's what what led me into this treatment. The treatment by this practitioner. If you've looked at a lot into natural medicine, you may have seen the word nature cure type practitioner, old school practitioner. Very much, I used, and I had to prepare my own herbs. So a lot of dried herbs that you prepare daily. My mates used to call me Mr. Herb. So I'd walk around with these thermoses with these preparations. But we were doing a lot of processes as well. It wasn't so much using a lot of products and supplements. It was, yes, I was using herbs, but there were processes like for the first 50 nights in a row, I had to have a bath in hot water and put these herbs and oils in the bath, and then get out and sit with a tracksuit, hoodie, and a beanie and a scarf in a warm room and sweat for 45 minutes afterwards. It wasn't fun, but I understand it now as kind of like sauna therapy or creating diaphoresis and blood cleansing type approach. There were a range of other several other things that I did, and it culminated in a 2-week fast, which, if you can imagine, in the mid-90s, having someone tell you, particularly given I'd been a full-time athlete, having someone tell you can't eat for 2 weeks was fairly extreme.
Yeah, it sounds
Yeah, but I got to 10 days of a 16-day fast and just I hadn't felt that good in years. In fact, I'd never felt that good. And I wanted to keep going, and he got me to stop at around 16 days. And then it was a 4-week reintroduction to food. And from after that period, I felt better than I ever felt in my life. So the recovery that I'd had was so comprehensive. I felt absolutely fantastic. And it was a combination of a range of treatments. The fast certainly was the icing on the cake, but there was a lot more prior to that. And I was so sort of overwhelmed or so surprised by the extent of the recovery, because I had been aware from doing some reading that this was a very difficult thing to treat and to have people make full recoveries, that I became fascinated, and it became known because I'd been an athlete or a paddler at a fairly high level. I'd been international paddler, albeit briefly. People had got to know that I'd made a recovery and I was back training on the river and I could do what I wanted to. And so I started to receive calls from people from other sports saying, look, I've got this illness and I've been told to call you because you recovered. And so I became good friends with the Russian practitioner, Dr. Sultanov. And even though it took a long time to get to see, I was able to liaise with his clinic and get people in through cancellations and that, so get them in a bit quicker. So I guess several athletes had approached me and they went and saw the doctor, and most of them had the same sort of recovery. So eventually I said to this Russian doctor, I want to know more about what you do, I want to learn more. And he started referring me to books. And then eventually I said, I want to do what you do. And he told me I had to go back to uni. So originally I was going to go back and finish my psych studies. But he said, if you want to do this, you've got to go and do a natural medicine degree. So I went back to uni and did a 4-year Bachelor of Health Science degree in naturopathy. And that's, even though he was a doctor of medicine, he was using natural medicine. So he wanted me to do that degree. And so I did that. And with the eye to doing what he did and working with people with chronic illness, which I find myself 20 years later, that's what I work with, mostly with people, a lot with people with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, IBS, anxiety, depression, things like that. And so to a long story, and I'm sorry I took up all your time.
Firstly, awesome story. It's
Get a
amazing.
word in.
No, honestly, it's